hope each and every one of you are doing okay out there. Thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate you all for being here. I know it's been a very, very difficult couple of weeks. So we really appreciate you spending time with us. So thank you all for being here. So let me just go ahead and get started. My name is Shonda Green, and I'm a member of the E-Board, serving as the Vice President of Membership with the National Sales Network Philadelphia chapter. We have a great presentation for you today with a phenomenal speaker. But first, I would like to sincerely thank our corporate sponsors, Johnson & Johnson, Pfizer, and Stryker. Without your support, we would not be able to bring you this fantastic programming today. So thank you. This is going to be a very interactive webinar. We're going to be using features like the chat box, there's Q&A, and there's even going to be a poll, but you'll be prompted when to use them. Okay, so I want to just go over some quick announcements. So we are going to be having our happy hour resume clinic on June 11th. Make sure you take a picture of this screen because this is going to be a very, very nice happy hour. So bring your cocktail and your highlighter because we're going to take a look at some of your resumes and just kind of get you ready for that, for the Pfizer career fair, okay? So we want to make sure that you are all ready to go. So what is code switching, right? So code switching is a term most are unfamiliar with because it refers to behavioral adjustments that many people of color may feel is necessary to advance in corporate settings. But no one can explain this better than our speaker, Dr. Courtney McCluney. Currently, Dr. McCluney is the assistant professor of organizational behavior at Cornell University. Dr. McCluney's research investigates marginalization of practices within organizations, institutions, and societies that maintain inequality between dominant and marginalized groups. She's published numerous articles, book chapters, reports on race, gender, and diversity in organization, and has received grants, awards, and fellowships to support her work. Dr. McCluney has received her PhD in psychology at the University of Michigan and has gotten her BA in psychology and interpersonal organizational communications at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. She's received her work she previously worked as a research fellow at Catalyst, Inc., which is a global nonprofit that works with businesses to advance women, and has served as an AmeriCorps resident in social enterprise. Before we bring Dr. McCluney, I would like to take a moment of silence. I would like to take a moment of silence for all the victims of racial injustice in this country. And I would like to say loud and clear that Black lives absolutely matter. Please take a moment of silence with me. Thank you. Dr. McCluney, please take it away.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Just making sure the audio is working. Oh, excuse me. All right, I'm going to remove this header off of my screen. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much to the National Sales Network Philadelphia chapter for inviting me to share some of my research on code switching. I echo Shonda Green's point that this is a very troubling time in our history. Unfortunately, not a new one. This is one that has been ongoing for several decades at this point. And it is the current moment that we're in and have been in for a while that also informed me and my colleagues for doing this work. So I'd just like to, again, extend my thanks to Nikki Bay Crawford, Diana Cave, Keisha Faulkner Jenkins, and to Shonda Green for organizing this space for us to have this very important conversation, especially one that is likely to be relevant to the working lives of people who are part of the National Sales Network. So as Shonda mentioned, my apologies, in this presentation, we're talking about code switching as a phenomenon that is part of Black employees' everyday lived experiences. And there are a couple things that we want to accomplish in this session. So first, and as she's already shared, we have a definition of code switching, and we want to really ground it within the Black professional experience, and also pose it as one of the key dilemmas that Black people face in and throughout their working lives. We also want to identify some of the psychological and social costs of code switching that Black employees will encounter, but also organizations. There are clear consequences for organizations as a whole that if they encourage Black employees to code switch. We'll then think about our current working situations during this global pandemic. I know a lot of us have been asked to work from home to help flatten the curve. And even as we're starting to phase back into removing some of the social distancing measures, there are still certain aspects of working from home that will complicate code switching experiences for Black professionals. And I'd be really excited to hear your thoughts and experiences on this aspect of your working lives in particular. And finally, I would invite you all to reflect on your code switching experiences and think of alternate ways of expressing yourselves and ourselves when we are in the workplace. So as Shonda mentioned, we're going to have a couple of ways to interact and engage with you. And one of them is by poll questions. And so we actually have a beginning poll question for all of our attendees here today. And it asks you to share how often it is that you code switch at work. So please select one of the options here. You can define what always, often, occasionally, infrequently, or never means for you. And after a few seconds, we will close the poll, and then I'll make a broader commentary on what it is that I'm noticing and how this reflects on the research that my colleagues and I have conducted. We have a little over half of our votes, and seems to be a really interesting distribution of responses, mostly around the middle, that people find that they're occasionally or often code switching at work. And it's looking like it's slowing down a little bit, so I'll give it a few more seconds before closing the poll. I want to make sure everyone gets a chance to share their opinion. And let's close it out now. Okay, so it looks like almost half and half of, or not half, but majority of people feel that they often or occasionally are code switching at work. This is reflective of some of the data that my colleagues, who include Dr. Miles Durkee at the University of Michigan Psychology Department, and a lot of his doctoral students, and some of my former undergraduate research assistants, a lot of the work that we have done with Black professionals finds that more often than not, Black people in particular feel that they're code switching, and this also pervaded into other racial minority groups as well. There have been questions around whether or not other groups can code switch, and identities around gender and sexual orientation. For the purposes of this webinar, we are focusing on race and Black employees' experiences in particular, but there will certainly be overlap with other groups as well. So thank you all for participating in that poll. We'll now move on to having this physical definition of code switching. Oh, sorry, making sure I get functionality back. There we go. And all these slides will be available to you after today's presentation, so no need to take furious notes on the things that I'm saying. But as Shonda mentioned earlier, we think of code switching as a strategy that Black employees and people of color more broadly might use in order to survive and successfully navigate interracial situations and interactions. These interactions can range from everyday work relationships to police encounters, and everywhere from educational settings to interactions in public settings, such as parks. And code switching is when people adjust how they present themselves, their style of speech, their appearance, behavior, and there is a goal or a reason behind why people are doing this. And the definition sort of encapsulates all the different reasons why someone might code switch. And it's usually to optimize the comfort of others who have some sort of power, resource, or entity that the person who is code switching needs, whether that is to be treated fairly, to receive compensation, for some sort of appropriate exchange in order for the work that they're doing, and opportunities. So we'll delve more into that as it relates to the code switching domain in the workplace. But we can certainly think about this phenomenon as occurring across people's lives and in various settings. So one of the questions that my colleagues and I asked in our survey of 300 Black professionals based in the US was why they code switched. What were some of the individual motivators and also perhaps contextual features that would increase the likelihood of someone engaging in code switching behaviors at work? And this is what we found. Usually people who scored high on having career aspirations and leadership aspirations in particular within a certain field were more likely to report that they code switched at work. I'm going to read a quote from one of our participants that helps to further illustrate this point. They said, if you're being judged by some random person, it is easier to dismiss it because they probably have no effect in your life. But when you're being judged by coworkers in a place that you want to build a career in, it's not an easy dismissal. Those perspectives hold weight because it can make or break your career here in America. We had several comments like that coming from our participants that would suggest individuals' perceptions of them in the work environment is likely to influence how they present themselves. And in some cases, whether or not they switch how it is that they speak or their name choice, etc. There's also notions of this desire to be perceived as a good fit in your organization, and cultural fit has been recognized by lots of scholars who study inequality and racial bias as something that prohibits and actually decreases the experiences or the likelihood of Black people entering into certain occupations, but also into educational settings. So whenever people say that we would like for you to have a good fit here, fit tends to be racialized, gendered, has its own sense of identity of what does it mean to fit inside of an organization. And that desire to have a fit would lead people to adjust their behavior so that they can match those expectations others have of them in their workplace. This is especially true in professional work environments. And finally, the people who indicated that they have high levels of vigilance are also more likely to code switch at work. Vigilance is a concept that we have taken from people who study stereotype threat. Also, it's associated with some health-related consequences. But vigilance ultimately means that you anticipate discrimination or you anticipate being treated unfairly on your day-to-day lived experiences in and outside of the workplace. That anticipation then influences your behaviors throughout your day and throughout your lives. So people who report high levels of vigilance that they anticipate there being some form of mistreatment unless they adjust their behavior are more likely to code switch at work. Here was one quote that we had from a participant that pointed out this concept of vigilance very well. It says, it has been my specific experience that it is simply easier to anticipate the complaints, jokes, and negative comments and just adapt to my coworkers' discomfort and ignorance in order to maintain workplace peace. So rather than address or confront some of the issues, a lot of Black people in our study stated that they anticipate that they would be treated differently and in some cases discriminatorily from presenting themselves in the workplace. So therefore they code switch in order to minimize those instances. In addition to some of these individual level factors as to why people might code switch, there's also contextual factors that we found in our data. One was the racial composition of the workplace. So people who worked in organizations that had roughly equal numbers of non-white people and white people in the workplace are more likely to code switch. We delved deeper into some of the quotes to further illustrate this point of racial composition. And most of our participants worked in an organization where the higher you went in the organizational hierarchy, the whiter the company became. So code switching sort of correlated with the high career aspirations there, where it's not just that there's a lot of white people that work with me, but they are in positions of power. And so that would lead them to code switch more. And then there was perceptions on the climate for diversity. So what was the feelings of inclusion like in the workplace beyond representation of particular racial groups? And in those instances, participants also found that companies that have really low climates for diversity, so there's not a clear reporting structure, for instance, of when an event happens that is discrimination or microaggression, or there's not a separate space for talking about inclusion and diversity, they report high levels of code switching. Surprisingly, we also found that people who work in companies that have really high levels of diversity climate is also reporting code switching. That puzzled us a bit, but we looked further into their open-ended data to make sense of that finding. And what we saw was people who worked in companies that over-exaggerated differences between groups tended to have high levels of stereotypes attached to particular groups. So for instance, these are companies that say, oh, let's celebrate Black people, let's have insert stereotypical food item here, or let's ask these specific questions that are part of a stereotype of Black people's work experiences. So in those situations, in order to avoid the stereotypes attached to Black people, individuals in our study reported code switching in those instances where companies sort of overcorrect for diversity and end up causing more harm. So all of this together suggests that there are some things organizations can do in order to minimize the need for code switching. One is to increase the diversity at high levels of organizations so that the senior leadership is not majority white, and also to have a more balanced approach to diversity climate, where you do accept and tolerate differences, but you also grapple with the nuances within each particular racial group. So not thinking that all Black people are the same, for instance, and instead taking a more nuanced approach while keeping in mind structural inequalities that disproportionately affect particular groups like Black people. So in addition to trying to understand why people might code switch at work, we also look to see when individuals would code switch at work. These were largely based off of previous studies, and they're not comprehensive by any means. I assume that people are code switching on a daily basis, but disproportionately, respondents in our study indicated that they code switch at two major points in their career. One is when they're applying and interviewing for a position. There have been decades worth of research that shows the bias attached to Black identity as prohibiting people from getting a foot in the door in most companies. These are known as the resume bias studies, where individuals send out false resumes that are similar on every dimension except the name, and the name alone can signal someone's racial identity background. And for the last few decades, this has been going on for a while, there has been continuous racial bias attached to Black sounding names. In a recent study, my colleague Sonia Kang at the University of Toronto Rotman School of Management, her and her colleagues went even further, and they looked at Black and Asian students, not only resumes, but also techniques that they engaged in called resume whitening. So in these instances, they had their students not only send in false resumes, but send in resumes that had been whitened in some way. So for Asian students, this mostly looked like choosing a English name in lieu of their actual names. For Black people, for their Black students, this looked like changing your affiliations with particular groups. Instead of saying I was president, let's say, of a historically Black sorority or of a Black organization, I would just say I was president of a sorority and take the racial aspect out of it. Or I was the leadership of a student group, not the Black student group. And they actually saw that the more whitened resumes had higher chances of receiving callbacks than the resumes that did not engage in these whitening techniques. The other disheartening aspect of their study was looking at these whitened resumes attached to particular companies. Companies that had diversity statements and said they valued equity and inclusion and wanted to diversify were more likely to select whitened resumes than they were non-whitened resumes. So this suggests that companies actually are continuing to perpetuate biases and actually want a certain kind of Black person in their organization, possibly one that code switches or knows how to dampen their Blackness in a way so that they can appear more white. The other time throughout people's career that they tend to code switch most often is when they're seeking a promotion. Code switching in some ways can help Black employees foster relationships at work. And for this study, or for this aspect of our finding, we draw heavily on work that was completed by Dr. Tracy Dumas, the late Catherine Phillips, who is a professor at Columbia Business School, Nancy Rothbard is professor at the Wharton School, and I believe that Tracy is at the University of Cincinnati Ohio State University at the Fisher College of Business. Tracy is also gonna think that I intentionally got her affiliation wrong because I went to Michigan and she's at Ohio State. For anyone who knows that, there's a huge rivalry. Anyway, so in their study, they looked at the networking experiences of Black employees, and they called it getting closer at the company party. they found that Black employees were quite hesitant to get closer personally to a lot of their colleagues, mainly because they were fearful of stereotyping and prejudice that could emerge. And they found that racial dissimilarity between whites and Blacks in their study predicted lower senses of closeness to the colleagues, and also a sense of integration or belief that they would like to be friends with me, or they would fit in our group of peers. So Black employees tended to feel like they couldn't be their authentic selves in these networking situations, and would therefore miss out on a lot of opportunities that could lead to promotions, especially internal to their company. So in order to correct for this bias, or this inability to get closer at the company party, they found that employees were in some ways modifying their everyday experience, where they might authentically want to talk about a certain topic, but if they felt that it was something that would alienate them from their majority white colleagues, they would switch up their interests to instead express interest to things that might be more appealing to majority white colleagues, for instance. So this was a form of code switching behavior. And when you're seeking to network with those who are different from you, there could be that pressure to modulate how it is that you're expressing yourselves in order to bridge that gap between the two. So I just shared a lot of information with you, and I'd like to give you a chance in the chat right now to add your ideas of some cues that you might have seen in your particular company or throughout your career that would encourage you to code switch or to not code switch at work. I believe that you all will now have access to your chat function so that we can see some of the perceptions that you have. And I think I have to bring back there we go. So I'm going to open up the chat now, and I'm going to make a comment on, I'm looking for the chat. Here we go. There's the chat. Yay, go blue. Okay, so asking you now to share, why do you or do you not code switch at work? What are some of the cues that signal you to code switch at work? So I mentioned how if you're looking for a job, or if you're looking for a promotion, that might be a motivator to code switch. Also, if you're feeling high levels of vigilance, etc. So let's scroll down. Anytime I'm interacting with a superior at work, feel that pressure to code switch. When speaking in front of a group or team at work, colleague makeup. Some people are commenting on the whitening of the resume using initials instead of full names. The physical appearance. So we're definitely going to talk about physical appearance and hair in a moment. It depends on the interaction. This is another form of code switching. I'm glad someone brought this up. You don't want to be known as a person who's always bringing up and talking about race. That is definitely another form of code switching that we have observed in our data. It's also really attached to what's happening in the world right now. My colleagues and I wrote an additional paper on this desire to call in Black at work sometimes, especially when there's another instance of police violence and killing of unarmed Black people, that I actually am too tired to code switch that day. So I'd rather call into work, so that way I don't have to constantly modulate my emotions or bring up race again and be that person. But now I'm definitely the person that brings up race. I attached it to my research agenda. And so now my colleagues know what they're going to get when they're working with me. Let's see. Looking at some of the other ones, when providing a presentation to customers. Okay, so interacting with clients when there's sales involved, totally makes sense. Code switch to appear non-threatening, absolutely. Threats are a huge part of why Black men and women in particular would code switch. One of my colleagues at the Harvard Kennedy School, Robert Livingston, did a paper with Nicholas Pierce, who's at the Kellogg School of Management, called the teddy bear effect. And they found that when Black men had a younger looking face and demeanor, that they were seen as less threatening and more likely to have promotions at work than Black men who were larger and who otherwise had a somewhat threatening demeanor. So that is absolutely a reason why people might not want to present their authentic selves and instead code switch. I'm just gonna look at a few more and then we're gonna move on So at networking events, allowing nicknames, I totally get that. I thought Courtney was one of the widest names I could have, but people still find ways to shorten it. So I totally agree with that. And I've experienced that personally. A lot around the names. And then finding places where you do not feel the need to code switch. We're definitely going to talk about that in a moment. So I'm excited that you all are sharing this. And let me pull out maybe two more. Having an American name to fit in regards to a business perspective, this was a question. We will answer questions at the end, so I'm going to hold some of those. I encourage you to put them in the Q&A box, so that way we have a list of all the questions. Do as the Romans do when you're in Rome. Steer clear of race-related topics, not to be the angry one. And I'll look at one more. If I didn't tone down my aggression, I would not make it here. Therefore, I had to learn how to code switch. Yeah. And things like aggression, threat, they're attached to stereotypes that have been perpetuated to multiple groups. So it's really interesting that you all are already picking up on that and see that as being an intimate part of your experience. Thank you for participating in those. We have a few more of these chat ideas that we will prompt you with. So please keep your keyboards nearby so that way you can add to the chat. We'd love to hear more from you. Okay, let's move forward with our presentation. So now I want to share the different dimensions of code switching that we've measured in our scale, and then talk about the consequences that we have seen with code switching. And wanted to quickly point out that these costs associated with code switching have both positive takeaways and negative takeaways for individuals' careers, and those are really important to highlight. So first aspect of code switching that we noted in our research was this desire to downplay your racial identity. So those are things like whitening your name or not trying to be affiliated with your particular racial group. You try not to act like in a stereotypical way of other members of your racial group. For people who did that in our study and across numerous studies, we find that there is an increased perception of their professionalism. Ashley Rosette at Duke University in the Fuqua School of Business and Drew Carton at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, they had a study that was interesting in terms of the think manager, think male model. They added white male to that. And the more that leaders were associated or perceived as a white male, the more they were perceived as professional. So downplaying your racial identity actually does have real material consequences if your desire is to be perceived as a professional in certain settings. This also increases your likelihood of hiring, as I talked about earlier with the whitening of resumes. That is downplaying your racial identity in order to increase your perceptibility of being a good hire for companies. In terms of some of the negative consequences of downplaying your racial identity, these can come from intra-group peers. So there could be this accusation of you acting white. We most often have seen this research in educational settings, and my colleague Miles Durkee that I mentioned earlier has done this work with middle school, high school age, and even college age students, where this accusation of acting white, especially coming from fellow Black people or for other people of color groups coming from your intraracial group, has huge psychological consequences in terms of distress, feeling inauthentic, and not being able to formulate a really strong, grounded identity in your race if you are accused of acting white. So those are some of the consequences that are attached to downplaying your racial identity. Positives for your career, but could be negative for your mental and psychological well-being. The second dimension of code switching that we looked at in our data was this desire to avoid stereotypes. So first, that requires knowledge of the stereotypes that are attached to your particular racial group, and then engaging in certain behaviors in order to avoid those. For Black employees, some of those common stereotypes that come up in the workplace are notions of incompetence, laziness, anger, etc. So when people seek to avoid those, there could be some positives attached to it. One, if you're seeking to not be seen as incompetent, you're likely working really hard or doing your due diligence to ensure that you're not making mistakes. And this increases your perceptions of being a leader. Ashley Rosette, who I mentioned earlier at Duke, has done lots of studies and experiments looking at the perception of a leader when they make a mistake or not, and when they are a Black man or woman and a white man or woman. And she finds that Black women and men are doubly penalized for making mistakes at work because it feeds into this narrative of incompetence. So when you're looking to avoid incompetence and working extremely hard to ensure you don't have any mistakes and that you're perfect, it could increase your perceptions of leadership and also result in high performance. Because if you're working really hard on a task, depending on the type of work that you're doing, it could lead to more sales, for instance. However, that could also be emotionally taxing work. And this mantra of working twice as hard to get half as far definitely rings true in this instance. It is found to contribute to burnout and to contribute to this emotional tax. So as Shonda said in my introduction, I worked at Catalyst Inc. during my time as a graduate student and was part of developing out this research on the emotional tax and day-to-day experiences among Black women and men in the workplace. So coupled with already feeling like you're different and that you have to be vigilant, working twice as hard to get half as far just continues to contribute to this overall sense of burnout and never feeling like you're getting far enough to be treated equally to your peers, even if you're outperforming them. So avoiding stereotypes, again, can have some positive consequences in terms of you actually being a high performer, but it doesn't always result in meeting some of your career goals and could contribute to overall sense of burnout. The final dimension of code switching that we looked at in our data was this expressing interest of the dominant group. So as I mentioned in the code switching or in the networking study led by Tracy Dumas and colleagues, this desire to network and to show, that I have an interest or knowledge of certain topics that individuals who are leaders in my company find interesting and important, those can lead you to engage in this form of code switching, where I'd rather talk about another topic, but if these are the things that my superiors are interested in, I'm going to go learn how to play golf, for instance. So engaging in that behavior does a couple things. On the one hand, it can help promote similarity with dominant group members in your organization. And there is this grounded phenomenon within psychology research called the similarity attraction paradigm. And it goes beyond romantic interest to actual affiliation, where we like people who tend to be like us, or we think that they're similar to us. So the more that you can promote this sense of similarity with people who are from members of dominant groups, the more likely are you to be promoted and to be included in their inner circle, for instance, or seen as one of the people in their dominant, powerful group. On the other hand, there are some clear consequences associated with expressing interest of the dominant group members and showing yourself as being very similar to them, just in a different body. So more often than not, this leads to token status, where you can be the only one because you're falling in line with a lot of the interests that the dominant group has. It can also create unrealistic expectations for other employees of color. So if you, as a Black employee, talk a certain way and express interest in a certain way, and even if these are your actual interests and they're not actually attached to your race, it could unfortunately have a spillover effect that all Black people have the capability of speaking, behaving, and expressing themselves in this way. And so then that points Black people as being, you're not like them. You're different from other Black people because you have this capacity to present yourself in this way or to express interests that I have, or even that you can play golf, for instance. So in that instance, one of the downstream consequences is that it could also minimize beliefs of discrimination and exclusion that can occur within organizations if you somehow manage to make it through this proverbial concrete ceiling by expressing interest of the dominant group. It can say, well, if you can do it, then all Black people should be able to change their name and adjust their presentation, etc. So now I want to ask a follow-up poll question to you now that we've sort of described the different ways that you can code switch and the consequences of those. I'm curious to know to what extent you feel that your colleagues prefer that you code switch in the workplace. So not whether you code switch or not, but to what extent do you believe your colleagues around you want you to code switch at work? And these can be everyone from your coworkers to your supervisors and senior leaders. And once you finish voting, we'll show everyone's results. So that way we can see what the consensus of the group appears to be. And I'm just taking note of the distribution here and the number of people who are voting. Maybe a few more seconds. Okay, and give you like 10 more seconds and make sure you get your votes in. All right, and let's close the poll. I think that is, thank you. So is everyone able to see the results? I think so, okay. So this is really fascinating. A lot of you agree that your colleagues would actually prefer your code switching self in comparison to you not code switching at work. I know one person mentioned in the chat earlier that they would love to know the specific people who don't feel like they have to code switch at work or probably disagree in this way. So some people are adding to their comments and says, is it possible they don't even realize that we are code switching? That is certainly a possibility, and it actually spills over great into my next slide. So I'm gonna stop sharing these results because I think this is a great segue into the next aspect of our research. So in addition to surveying Black employees and asking them about their code switching experiences, we also did an experimental study where we let it be known to participants that this individual was code switching at work. So in that case, for people who may not be aware that people are code switching, we made it very explicit that they were. So in this experimental paradigm, we surveyed about 500 participants. They were Black and white, women and men, and they received an email from a fictional coworker at a law firm. And this coworker was Black. They were either a Black man or a Black woman. And they said, we are going to share some of the unspoken ways to succeed in this firm. So the Black person said that they were either going to code switch, and that is the way to succeed at this firm, or not code switch, and that was the way to succeed. The ways that they code switched in this experimental paradigm was by changing their name. So the woman's name, for instance, was Lakeisha, not to pick on Lakeisha, that is organizing the call here. And she said, oh, but people call me Renee at work. And for the man, his name was Lamar, he said, oh, people call me Matt. The other way they could code switch was through their hairstyle. So Lakeisha either said that she wore her hair in a natural style or that she would straighten it for work. And the final way that they code switch was by changing their speech patterns. So they either said, I strive really hard to speak standard English, to not use any vernacular, to speak very clearly, or I keep my natural style of speech, which sometimes includes African American vernacular English. And this is what we found. So for Black participants in the group, Black women and men said that the non-code switching employee was more professional, more likable, more likely to succeed at work, and that this is what people should aspire to, that we should not have to adjust our hair, our style of speech, our name in order to succeed in the workplace. So they said, you should definitely keep your name. However, all the Black participants, or majority of them, agree that you should change how you speak at work. So there were dimensions of the code switching that they agreed with. But the thing that we found that was most strong was that Black people felt you should be able to wear your natural hair at work. Now, for white participants, we found the exact opposite. White women and men evaluated the code switching employee as more professional, more likely to succeed at work, and they preferred working with this employee than the non-code switching employee. However, they also said that they prefer the Black sounding name, which goes against all the resume bias studies that I mentioned earlier. And where there was the strongest disconnect between the white participants and Black participants was beliefs about Black people's hairstyles at work. So Black participants said you shouldn't have to change your hair. White participants said that you should. And I will read this one quote from a white woman participant. She said, nappy hair does not belong in the workplace. And as part of this work that has led to the Crown Act, the Creating Respectful and Open Workplace for Natural Hair Act, which is seeking to ensure that natural hairstyles are protected not only in the workplace, but also in educational settings, because we're seeing this bias emerge more strongly for hair. So I'm gonna ask you another quick question. We're not gonna take as much time on this chat so that way we can get to Q&A. So if you could open up your chat again and think about some of the other ways that you might code switch and work beyond what we have already described. So some of the ones you've already mentioned, things like not talking about race too much, going back to some of my calling in Black research where you don't want to manage your emotions. Are there any other consequences that you might have experienced from code switching or not at work? So some of the consequences that I've already mentioned were, you could have this increased likelihood of professionalism, especially from power holders who tend to be majority white in this country. But at the same time, you could have strong psychological distress, feelings of inauthenticity, etc. So the chat is now open to everyone to comment to each other. So I'll give you just a minute to share your ideas, if possible, on some of the other ways you might code switch at work, and then some of the consequences that you might have experienced. Taking vacations. I think this is the next stage of diversity, equity, and inclusion, is ensuring that people are allowed to rest, and that is a whole other presentation. I can come back and talk about the need to rest. So I love that. Physical ramifications, high blood pressure, stress, and anger. Absolutely. When you're quelling your emotions or engaging in emotional labor, it leads to and contributes to lots of physiological distress on the body. And some of my ongoing research on vigilance is looking at that as well, where the higher ranked Black people are in organizations that are predominantly white, the higher their blood pressure tends to be as well. Once you code switch, you can never go back, absolutely, because then you get labeled as aggressive or problematic. The days that I'm not feeling it, people are like, what's wrong with you? What happened? If I'm not, my normal chipper self. Wearing neutral colors, absolutely. I think about that often with what we wear at work. Don't ask me any questions. I'm gonna give you like a few more seconds. Being emotionally drained after work, absolutely. Your hair, yeah. Hairstyle, fingernails, yes, absolutely. Limited conversations. So you're also not able to be your full self with your coworkers, which can have great consequences for your ability to form relationships, and also for them to get a chance to know you and what it is that you are interested in and can do. Okay, so let's close the chat for now. Thank you all so much for contributing. And we're gonna switch over to thinking about our current working from home conditions and how that might foster a unique sense of code switching for participants or for Black employees. So as you know, we've been advised in the US to work from home if possible to help flatten the curve of this coronavirus pandemic. There are afforded benefits of physical distancing that some people are reporting. This likelihood to spend more time with family. Video conferencing and telecommuting may be the new way of working in the future. And some companies are also seeing this as an opportunity to increase their diversity of employees, where if employees before were reluctant to move to certain parts of the country because of their lack of diversity in that geographic space, now they can work for a company remotely and virtually if this is going to be the new normal for a while, so companies can actually increase their diversity in some ways. However, my colleague, Dr. Laura Morgan Roberts, who's at the University of Virginia Darden School of Business as well, and a regular Harvard Business Review contributor, we are working on a piece now that's thinking about how the current work from home scenarios can actually create a conundrum for Black employees. And the conundrum is that working from home actually invites co-workers into our living space, and it undermines our ability to exercise control over how we present our identities. Essentially, we're not allowed to code switch as much when we're working from home, because video conferencing has transformed our formerly safe private spaces for authentic cultural expression into focal points of the public gaze. That means that we can send signals about working from home, everything from our social class status, for instance, the size of our workspace, to our identity affiliations. So when I was first in quarantine, I was staying with my partner, and he has a lot of beautiful African art around his home. But some of the African art shows certain aspects of people's bodies that is totally normal within his culture, but would cause eyebrows to raise in professional work settings, for instance. So this invasion of this personal space that we have that is meant to be a safe haven where we don't have to code switch anymore could actually increase lots of biases and judgments of Black professionals who are working from home. Shonda Buchanan wrote this beautiful piece in the Sisters blog from the AARP website on Zooming While Black. And in it, they describe how their professional image has been compromised when working from home, especially as salons are closed, for instance, and we have more of our natural hair at work, or even, like I said, some of your artwork in the background. I want to quickly read one quote from this blog that I thought was really compelling. It says, "In a virtual space with just my cute smile, unruly locks, and quickly typed questions in the chat box, I felt odd and spatially closer than I had ever been to my colleagues, a little more exposed, a little more vulnerable. Zoom offered a window into our private spaces, and closing off mine, like some others had done, wasn't an option. Midway through, one colleague thrust his adorable dog towards the camera lens. Trying to one-up him, another colleague took off his tennis shoe and presented it to us like a gift. I was stunned, but I willed my face into a mask. My colleagues seemed unconcerned with their own images, comfortable in this virtual space. In contrast, I am constantly aware of the race representation card in all executive gatherings. I would have never behaved as they did." And part of the reason why Shonda wouldn't behave in that way, and why it might be difficult for Black people to behave in that way, is because professionalism is coded. As I've shown in some of the earlier research, you are more likely to be seen as professional the more white and male that you are. And some aspects of professionalism include this white middle class social standards, the segmentation of work and non-work, standards of appearance that tend to follow European standards of beauty, and this expectation that people bring only their work selves to work. So if you don't fit this professional image ideal, it is really difficult for you to then walk this tightrope of working from home and experimenting between the boundaries of work and non-work life. So we're hoping that companies can have more consciousness of their biases and judgments that might creep in as they have this window into Black cultural life through this virtual working from home setting. And in any instance, these settings can amplify portrayals of Black employees as the other and further marginalize them at work. Let me check the time. So I will skip this chat for a moment, but I do want to know, I guess you all can continue to add to this chat, but I won't make comments on it for now, just so we have it documented for purposes of the webinar. So is that okay if they include that, Diana, for people to answer in the chat? How have you code switched while working from home? And what motivated you to code switch during these moments? I'd be curious to know if you could share some of those. I am looking for the chat. I minimized it, so I don't know where it went. There we go. Moving art off the wall, styling my hair, yeah. Moving books behind me, absolutely. Changing camera angles, yep. So please keep using the chat. I'm gonna continue on describing some of the things that we've recommended for companies to do while employees are working from home in order to ensure that they're minimizing bias and facilitating inclusion. So one of the things that we recommended was companies need to provide options on how employees can work remotely. So encourage the use of phone meetings instead of video, which also can help contribute to well-being. Being on virtual calls all day is actually not healthy. Also use email communication in lieu of face-to-face, and enable employees to set their own hours. So that way you can at least know when you need to be on at work and when you can turn it off. We're also encouraging companies to adjust their expectations for engagement and commitment. So as we said, coronavirus is disproportionately affecting communities of color, and racism has not stopped. Police brutality and killing of Black people has continued throughout this coronavirus and before it, and possibly will continue afterwards. So there needs to be clear expectations of why an employee may not look as happy in their virtual work from home situation, especially Black employees, as they're dealing with the ongoing issues that are affecting them. It could likely decrease their sense of engagement and commitment because they are physically exhausted. Okay, so I wanted to leave you all with some of these reflection questions, and then we'll switch over into the Q&A. So as you think about your own code switching behaviors, either when you are doing it or when you're intentionally not doing it. Here are some of the things that can help you assess the situation and understand what it is that are your social cues to code switch. Being mindful of your feelings, both your psychological but also physiological reactions to code switching or not. And then being really clear about what there is to gain or lose by code switching or not doing it. Being mindful of these dimensions of our behaviors will help us to assess whether or not we might want to leave our current work situation, for instance, or how we can adjust our expectations around how I'm going to behave in certain settings. I also encourage you to evaluate what are the standards of professionalism in your workplace. And then especially for company leaders to also evaluate your standards of professionalism. What is it that you're asking your Black employees to do? Do you want them to be there, but to be there and be silent about issues affecting the Black community? Or do you want them to be there and assimilate to your standards of professionalism? And what's at stake when you ask people to conform in those ways? Lots of research showed that the more people are able to be authentic at work, the more creative they are, innovative, and the more likely they are to be committed to the organization. So by asking people to quell their authenticity and in code switch more, you're actually missing out on lots of the talent that you have hired and are seeking to develop in your organization. And then for those who are in positions of power, I encourage you to reflect on and think on how you might use your position to create more inclusive companies so that code switching no longer becomes the default, but it's just another strategy that we could use but are not forced to use in our everyday working lives. And with that, I'll switch over to the Q&A and encourage you all to use the Q&A box so that we can answer your questions together.
That was such an amazing presentation. And as we go into the Q&A portion, which I encourage everyone to send your questions to Q&A, I'm going to read those out. I would first like to acknowledge all of the e-board members of Innocent Philadelphia. You guys are amazing. But there's one special shout out that I want to recognize, and that's our VP of events, that's Diana Cave, who has worked tirelessly to make sure that this event ran flawlessly.
Yes.
Have no idea how much work goes into this, but we thank you so much. Okay, so now we're going to go into that Q&A portion, and Dr. McCluney, I'll just read these out for you.
Sounds good.
Okay, so first, I'd be curious of how interview and job discrimination changes as more and more people are using LinkedIn and including their photo. What do you recommend regarding photos on LinkedIn?
Yes, so there have been very few studies looking at LinkedIn for job networks and for interviewing, for instance. Photos are definitely clear markers of your race. And if they're anything like the resume bias studies, I'm not sure that we'll see huge distinctions. I think the main thing LinkedIn photos can do, and something in terms of a code switching behavior, is if you have straightened hair in your photo, but then show up at work with natural hair, that could be a really interesting experiment to see. But otherwise, your photo is clearly showing your race. And if it's associated with the biased resume studies, then we're likely to see that bias continue because they know your race at that point. Yeah.
Thank you. Have you found that adults teach children how to code switch? There may have been some instances growing up where my parents have coached me on how to behave amongst white people, answering the phone a certain way, greeting people, being very guarded about my personal life.
Yeah, so whenever I was asked, what got you interested in code switching? I was like, I've been code switching since I was 4. My parents, it started with, you better not do X, Y, Z. You will do X, Y, ABC in this setting. It is certainly what's considered a socialization tactic of how it is that Black people feel that they have to raise their Black children in this country. And it goes from everything from survival. So how do you survive interactions with people who see you as a threat, for instance? And it goes on from there. I think what has become quite insidious in terms of code switching, there was a recent study by Lakshmi Ramanujan at Harvard Business School and Aaron Reed at McMaster University. They found that there are lots of organizations popping up that are looking to increase the socialization of young people of color to be more professional by making them less of their ethnic background and more white in a lot of ways. So basically teaching them how to code switch. And lots of companies, Fortune 500 companies, for instance, are partnering with these training incubators to help socialize people to become more professional, which I thought has been really fascinating. So it goes beyond the individual parent-child relationship socialization to an actual precursor to a lot of companies. And I think that's actually going to have quite damaging effects on our expectations for inclusion and equity in companies moving forward.
Why does the fact that a person who has longer fingernails are perceived differently or non-professional in business? Diversity is supposed to be very active today. Some people grew up in different areas of the country.
Yeah, I honestly think the long fingernails, I think it is one of those things, that cultural aesthetic that has been attributed mostly to Black culture. And like most things in Black culture, it's only cool when white people do it. And not cool, but like it's only acceptable when white people do it. And we call this cultural appropriation, where there's clear profit benefits, for instance, off of taking something that's considered a Black cultural aesthetic and putting it on a non-Black person. So long fingernails, unfortunately, I think has been one of those things. It's just another characteristic of being Black, similar to your name, to your hairstyle, et cetera. And attaching these things to a Black identity means that you're also attaching it to stereotypes. So to say that long nails are quote unquote ghetto or not professional is because it's attached to Black identity, I think, in a lot of ways. But people are from different parts of the country. In more urban areas, for instance, it's probably not considered as unprofessional as it is in rural spaces or spaces that don't have a lot of racial diversity. I was certainly told before going on interviews in my field to not put jewelry in my hair or to not have long fingernails. And I said, but this is what they're going to get on a day-to-day basis, but not in a coronavirus. Clearly, my nails need long nails. But yeah, I do think that that is why it's considered unprofessional, is because it's attached to Blackness.
If we're deciding to stop code switching, how do we explain the difference to co-workers who are accustomed to how we've been? They may feel the second version is inauthentic.
I love this question. Yeah, I do think it's going to require an interesting change. Part of the challenge that I have to non-Black coworkers is part of creating an inclusive work environment is to allow your Black colleagues to be themselves, knowing that their self is not a static entity. So as much as you're allowed to, non-Black person to have a range of emotions, for instance, or to express yourself in multiple ways, do you allow that same grace to other people? So if I come in one day and I'm chipper and the next day I'm not, am I allowed to be that way? What is it about me changing that actually makes the other person feel uncomfortable? I would actually put that on them to make sense of you being yourself in whatever way that is. It's just allowing a broader range for you to experiment and to present yourself at work. This actually is a great follow-up to a webinar that my colleague Veronica Rebello at San Francisco State University and I presented last week with the Executive Leadership Council. We talked about the various ways that diversity practices can effectually manage Blackness in the workplace. And one of the ways was by having this very narrow field of how a Black person can be at work. And when you keep that narrow, then it makes everyone else feel uncomfortable when that Black person is no longer smiling, even though you just said a racial microaggression, right? Or that you tried to touch their hair and they didn't stop you and now they're stopping you and now you feel uncomfortable. It's because you have a very narrow acceptable range that you allow Black people to be. So if you broaden that range, then you broaden the opportunity for people to present multiple aspects of themselves at work instead of trying to hold them to a narrow standard.
Got some great questions coming in, Dr. McCluney. I just want everybody to know that Dr. McCluney has agreed to stay on an additional 15 minutes. So be sure to keep those questions coming. And I actually got a whole lot right here. So I just want to make sure that you guys know that this isn't just going to shut off at 6, okay? So there's one question that stood out to me and let me go back up to it. As a Nigerian immigrant, I often feel like I'm at an intersection of Black and the African experience. Black and African experience. Do you have any research around immigrant experience, names, etc., and navigating, oops, this thing went up.
Yeah.
Let me see. Navigating stereotypes about Africans?
Yes. So I personally have not done research in this domain. This has certainly come up as of late with, I believe it was Harvard Business School or Harvard University broadly. So they have done a lot of work around racial equity in their admissions, for instance. And one of the things that Black American students pointed out was that they have a lot more Black immigrant students coming into Harvard than Black American students. And what does that mean? And that's been a really interesting challenge for all universities to think about the premium that they place on what it means to be Black. And what does it mean to be Black African immigrant versus Black American? So as far as I know, there aren't like in my field, I can't think of specific studies that look at specific stereotypes at the intersection of those identities. But I do know that there's emerging work in these universities around understanding what is it that we value about the Black immigrant experience that we may not value about the Black American experience. What sort of expectations do we have for a Black immigrant that we do or do not have for Black Americans? So the immigrant narrative of you see America as a happier place than where you came from, otherwise you wouldn't have came. Not saying that that's my beliefs, but I believe that narrative is out there. I do believe universities think that Black African immigrants may not be as demanding that they change because you came here, so clearly you value us. Whereas Black Americans are like, we've been here and we demand and expect better of you. The only other place that I'm thinking about research is in Brazil and in France and in places that don't have racial categories. So in France, for instance, they don't recognize racial groups, neither do they in Brazil. So the way that they have documented inequalities are associated with colorism and skin tone bias. And so you can literally, in Brazil especially, map out the skin tones of people in the country and health inequalities, wealth inequalities, et cetera. So I know that work is happening globally, but we certainly need more work here in the US on what does it mean to be Black African in terms of the expectations that companies have of you compared to that might be consistent or different than Black Americans. I know in society, there doesn't seem to be a clear distinction. We were talking about police violence earlier, and some of the earlier instances of police violence were Black immigrants that police were enacting extreme brutality and force. So I don't think they're making a distinction at all. But in companies, I do wonder if there is a different expectation. Great question.
Definitely.
Yeah.
How do you handle curiosity about different hairstyles? I don't want to bring too much attention every time I change my hair.
Yeah, I'm lacking patience on hair. I'm a person who loves to change my hair as a form of self-care, to have different hairstyles constantly. But I am tired of it being a topic of conversation in meetings. So I personally, and I don't know the research to back this, but I personally discourage too much conversation or attention or focus on my hair. And when people say, oh, but it's so whatever, different from mine, and that's why I'm so fascinated by it, I'd say, but you're really making me feel like an object, that I'm just something to ogle at and not to engage with. And I've told you that that's my boundary. I don't want to talk about my hair. And if you are fascinated, I recommend looking at lots of documentaries and reading lots of books that have been written and things that have been published about Black hair. And that's where you can do your own work. I do think some of the curiosity, well, let me not say that. Some people try to say, oh, but it's a positive thing. They're interested in your culture. And that could be true, but that doesn't mean you have to engage with it. For instance, when people say, oh, there's a positive stereotype that Black people can dance, I'm like, a stereotype is always a stereotype. I don't see the distinctions between positive and negative. I see it as limiting. Again, holding that narrow band of what it means to be Black. So I personally don't think you have to engage with people who are curious about your hair just because they're curious. If they're curious, go do what curious people do. Go read a book, go look it up, go learn for yourself. Yeah.
Take a look, it's in a book. Okay. Do you
is tired of us.
Do you find that those in the workforce for over a certain amount of time are less likely to code switch as much? For instance, I find that after 20 years, I'm more inclined to be in my authentic self, to work and choose not to say, and work not to stay with an employer that cannot accept my full talent and value.
Yes. So this is an empirical question that my colleagues and I have been grappling with for a while. So I don't know of any study that directly speaks to this, because one of the things that I pointed out in our presentation was once you get to certain levels, depending on how you got there, if you got there by code switching and now that you're at the top, that expectation might still be on you to code switch, or in an even more insidious fashion, to force other people to code switch and to actually police other people's behavior. The common example I like to use, just because it's popular, is on Insecure season 1. Molly is working at a law firm. She is, been there for a couple of years, and a young Black woman intern comes in and is not code switching. Rashida does not change her name. She's like, you can call me Rah Rah. She's speaking loud. And the white coworkers asked Molly to tell Rashida to code switch. Basically, they said, she's not fitting into our culture here. You need to have a talk with her about her professionalism. Even before they asked Molly to do it, Molly felt compelled to do it, to tell this Black woman, like, hey, you can't act like this. So for the people who are in positions of power, if you got there by code switching, I hope that you are not feeling pressure to then make sure everyone else code switches to get to the top as well. Because then that can create, like I said earlier, this minimization of beliefs of discrimination targeted towards specific groups if there's this expectation that all of you can code switch, therefore all of you do it. So there's lots of beliefs that all Black people can code switch and that they all want to, and those are not true. Black people are not a monolith. Some of us code switch, some of us don't, and the reasons why vary. But yeah, it's really interesting. I would love to, when we do the next study, most of the people that we surveyed were entry level or mid-level. I would certainly love to get more insight from people who are in senior level positions, how often they are code switching currently, and to what extent do they feel pressure to make other people code switch at their work. Yeah.
Given the climate, both pandemic and civil unrest, a lot of us are operating at less than our best. Can you offer any advice on how to continue to work and perform well so that it doesn't interrupt our development at work?
Absolutely. So some of the things I mentioned earlier about how to have an inclusive work from home situation, to the extent possible, making sure that it's okay with your manager, or having your manager read about how to encourage people to turn off their cameras, for instance, or to set their own hours, to say, hey, I will get this done, but I need to call in Black today. I can't do it today. I know we were talking yesterday, a lot of the organizers of this event, and said, we just didn't do it that day. We couldn't focus on work. So I do encourage taking time away. I think it's really hard to try to work through trauma, try to work through psychological distress. And hopefully, as many of these companies are publicly saying that they are in support of George Floyd and against brutality, I hope that also means that they are in support of their own Black employees and looking to minimize the harm that has been enacted on them as well for having to work through trauma. So for individuals, I think, as much as possible, trying to set your own hours, cutting off your camera if it's not necessary, and minimizing your contact with people who are not interested in what's happening right now. Yeah.
Absolutely. So there's one question that stood out to me because it's not funny, but just my personality. I'm good.
Okay.
Because it says, why is the work from home presenting more of a micromanaging arena? Is anyone else on the team experiencing this?
Is everyone on the team experiencing that micromanaging? To some extent, yes. For managers who are not used on how to manage virtual remote employees, this is new for everyone to figure out, how do I work with you without it seeming like I'm surveying you? I think the main difference that we want to emphasize in this piece by centering Black people's experiences is beyond micromanaging your actual work. There could be increased scrutiny and observation of your life that's in the background. So for instance, one of the things that I've noticed just personally, asking some of my friends who have children how working from home has been, I said, I think that narrative of Black women being bad mothers is coming up with me and my kids because they are running around, because me and my husband are both trying to work. And it looks like I can't, quote unquote, control them. And I was like, wow, that is really fascinating. I do think there are some large stereotypes that are attached to Black people, that small glimmers of a behavior that would activate a stereotype can become so powerful that they then pervade into how people are perceiving employees. So that whole notion of the single Black woman who can't control her kids, who doesn't have a stable home environment. There was a study published, I think 2 or 3 years ago. Lots of employers still have that belief. If they ask, if a woman mentions her children, they say, "Oh, are you married to their father? Do they know their father?" It is automatic response almost, and that bleeds into how we then perceive that person. Like, do we think that person is? We start going into our moral emotions, worthy, chaste, whatever. Like adding on the dimensions. This also works for fathers too. You can mention that you are a Black father, and there could be perceptions that you're not in your children's life. And lots of research, people who try to push for women to have higher wages, especially mothers, that tends to be a narrative that only fits white families. When you look at it from a Black family angle, Black men are not given the fatherhood bonus that white men are given for being fathers, because there's a belief that they're not taking care of their children anyway. So we don't see that fatherhood premium given to Black fathers that we do to white fathers. So if they see your kids in the background as a Black woman or man, there's going to be stereotypes that are literally attached to material consequences, like how much you're paid, or to what extent they think you can handle more responsibility at work, etc., based on their beliefs about your parenting. So I do think that everyone is experiencing micromanaging, but when you add in layers of race and gender, class, sexuality, etc., it becomes a different type of micromanaging. Then you're actually judging people's lives.
Thank you. Okay, guys, there are 2 more questions that we're going to answer, and then we are going to close the call, okay? I'll have a couple of announcements after, and then we're going to close the call. Okay, this is a good question. So regardless of how professional one may be, how do we overcome the unconscious racial mindset from our white coworkers, such as using proper diction and being labeled as being so articulate, or maintain a professional appearance, and hearing that comment of he and she is so well dressed, or being able to interact and hearing that he or she is so educated?
Yeah, these are really challenging things to overcome because they are so firmly implanted in people's minds. So I do believe that there needs to be more skill building and equipping of white people on how to work with Black people. I've been doing research in Detroit recently, and that city is experiencing a resurgence in businesses, for instance, but they're also seeing an uptick in white people coming into Detroit. And as a consequence of that, more police being called on Black people in Detroit from their white neighbors. So one of the things that the Detroit residents and business owners have asked for is, like, there needs to be a training manual for white people on how to work with Black people. And part of that is learning how to deactivate biases that have been firmly implanted in your mind from birth to now, and developing the skills to actively work against your own biases that you have against groups, so that if you see a Black person, again, in a broader range than that narrow, ideal that you have in mind, that you can develop the skill set to get past fragility, to get past resistance to seeing people who are different, and to really learn how to engage in your own self-inquiry. So part of the training that I've done with white employees has been around introspections. Like, before you ask about someone's hair or father or touch their hair, pause and ask yourself, why am I so fascinated with this Black woman's hair? Do a lot more self-inquiry before acting on the behavior. Those are skills that white people can learn. And that's what I've been encouraging them to do. And even Black people, it's like, we have to learn how to retool ourselves to not only see our successes as how well we speak or how we dress or succeeding in a predominantly white space, but to retrain ourselves to also see success in a broader lens as well.
Absolutely. Dr. McCluney, what an awesome presentation. Can you leave us with a call to action or something we can apply to our lives of Codeswitching?
Yes. Well, I think my call to action for Black people right now is to rest and to take care of yourselves, because your everyday working lives, on top of living in a very violent, racist society that does not value Black lives, is taxing and is emotionally and physically exhausting. So my call to action for Black people is to rest. My call to action to everyone else is to work to make this space more inclusive for us to be ourselves in every sense of the word. for Black people to be themselves, whether they choose to code switch or not. I'd like for that to be more of a choice than a requirement. And yeah, so that would be my call. Black people, get some rest. Everyone else, you got work to do. And it starts with building up these skills and taking action on them.
Thank you so much. This has been a wonderful presentation. And just so that everybody knows, this presentation, these slides will be available to you.
Yes.
Okay. And we also do have the recording. A couple of people were asking. Guys, here is Dr. McCluney's information. Is listed right here. Make sure that you follow her on her social media and take a look at her on LinkedIn. Now, I want to make sure that you guys are all aware that we are having our Happy Hour Resume Clinic on June 11th from 4:30 to 6. So make sure you bring your resume, get your highlighter, and have a cocktail, okay? And from everyone of the National Sales Network, we would like to thank you for joining us today.
Absolutely. And the last thing I'll say is that we are continuing to do research on your working from home experiences as Black employees. If you'd like to participate in our survey, the National Sales Network has a link, and they can send it out after this presentation along with the slides. So that way, we'd love to hear from you on how it is that you're working from home and what companies can be doing better to support you.
Thank you so much, Dr. McCluney. You guys, make sure that you answer the survey that's going to be sent out after this presentation. Thank you so much, Dr. McCluney.
Thank you, Shonda. Thank you, National Sales Network.